The first thing they told Lena Stroud when she walked into Mercy General was to make sure she refilled the supply cart before her shift ended. Not welcome, not glad to have you. The charge nurse, a broad-shouldered woman named Forsyth, who had apparently run the ER floor for 11 years, and had the energy of someone who'd stopped being impressed by anything around year 3, handed her a laminated checklist and pointed at a metal cart near the supply closet. Gauze, saline, tourniquets. Make sure the tourniquets are the right kind. Last new hire put Cat 7s in the wrong drawer, and it cost us 40 seconds on a bleeder. Stroud took the checklist. She didn't say anything about the tourniquets. She knew exactly what a Cat 7 was. She also knew the difference between a S-off-T wide and a RATS. Knew which one you reached for when your hands were shaking at altitude, and which one you used when the patient was a child. Knew what it felt like to cinch one down in the dark with someone screaming beneath you. She didn't say any of that. She just nodded and went to find the cart. That was her first shift at Mercy General. It would take 3 more weeks before anyone learned her last name. They called her the new one for most of it. Not cruelly, exactly. More the way a busy kitchen calls a new line cook the new one, until he proves he can keep up on a Friday night. The ER ran on a shorthand that took years to learn, and Stroud stood at the edge of it, like someone who just arrived in a country where she didn't speak the language. Except she did speak the language. She just let them believe she didn't. The attending on her unit was a man named Dr. Caulfield. Tall, confident, the kind of doctor who moved through the ER like he was the center of a solar system, and everyone else was orbiting him. He wasn't a bad physician, but he had a way of explaining things to nurses, a particular slowness, a particular tone that made clear he believed the gap between what he knew and what they knew was vast and probably permanent. He did it to everyone. He did it to Stroud a little more, because Stroud asked few questions and showed nothing on her face. And men like Caulfield tended to mistake stillness for confusion. The first week she shadowed, observed, learned the rhythms of the floor, where the attending liked the crash carts positioned, how Forsyth called codes, which techs were fast and which ones needed reminding. She filed every observation away without comment. She'd spent years doing exactly this, in places where reading a room correctly meant the difference between a good day and a catastrophic one. An ER in central Illinois wasn't a firebase in eastern Afghanistan, but the skill transferred. The second week, she started getting assigned patients. Routine cases, mostly, lacerations, fractures, chest pain in middle-aged men who turned out to be fine. She was efficient, quiet. She never rushed, but she was never slow. Forsyth watched her sometimes with an expression Stroud couldn't quite read, not suspicion. Something closer to the look a person gives a locked box they haven't yet decided whether to open. The problem started with Caulfield. It wasn't dramatic. It was small and constant. The way he would walk past her to address the tech she was working with. The way he would repeat instructions she'd already carried out. The way he'd gesture for her to move when he wanted to examine a patient. Like she was a piece of furniture that had drifted into the frame. She didn't react to any of it. She'd learned long ago that reacting was expensive, and she was careful with her energy. But the other nurses noticed. There was a travel nurse named Diaz who'd been at Mercy General for 4 months and had strong opinions about everything, and she cornered Stroud in the break room on a Tuesday afternoon. "He does that everyone at first," Diaz said. "New nurses especially. You just have to push back a little, let him know you're not a pushover." "I'm not a pushover," Stroud said. She poured herself coffee. "I'm just picking my moments." Diaz looked at her for a second. "How long were you at your last hospital?" "I wasn't at a hospital, travel nurse." "No." Diaz waited for more. Stroud didn't offer any. The conversation ended there, pleasantly enough. But Diaz carried the unfinished shape of it with her for the rest of the day. The third week was when Stroud started to feel the floor the way she'd felt other places. Not as a foreign environment to be navigated carefully, but as a system she understood, with its patterns and pressure points and moments of genuine danger. The ER was not a battlefield, but it had its own version of the same logic. Resources were finite, time was finite, and the difference between a good outcome and a terrible one often came down to a single decision made in the first 30 seconds. She thought about this on Thursday morning when the radio call came in. Multiple casualties, industrial accident at the Donahue Steel plant on Route 9. A section of scaffolding had collapsed during a maintenance operation, sending 4 workers to the ground from different heights. 2 were walking wounded. 1 had a broken pelvis. The 4th, a man named Ortega, had fallen 30 feet and landed partially on a concrete retaining wall. The paramedic's voice on the radio was controlled but tight. Crush injury to the thorax. Blood pressure dropping. ETA 4 minutes. The ER shifted immediately into a higher gear. Forsyth was calling assignments while the radio finished crackling. Caulfield swept out of his office, already pulling on gloves. Stroud took her position without being told. Trauma 2, where they'd be bringing Ortega. When the gurney came through the doors, she saw it immediately. The paramedics had done good work. IV access, oxygen, cervical collar. But Ortega's pressure was in the basement, and his breath sounds were asymmetrical. Left side was quiet. Not absent, but wrong. The kind of wrong that had a specific cause and a specific fix and a very narrow window. Caulfield was talking to the lead paramedic, getting the handoff. The resident, a young woman named Dr. Obi, was doing a quick visual assessment. The tech was hanging a second bag of saline. Everyone was moving, but no one had heard what Stroud had heard. She stepped to the left side of the gurney, pressed her stethoscope deliberately to Ortega's chest, listened for 4 seconds. "Tension pneumothorax," she said. Not loudly, just clearly. Nobody stopped. She said it again, directly to Obi. "His left lung is down. You need to needle decompress him. Right now." Obi looked at her, a flicker of uncertainty, not dismissal, and then looked at Caulfield, who had just turned from the paramedic. "What did she say?" Caulfield asked, addressing Obi. "She's saying tension pneumo," Obi said carefully. Caulfield walked to the head of the gurney and did his own assessment. Stroud watched him. She watched his face go through the same sequence hers had gone through 30 seconds ago. Listen, process, recognize. He reached the same place. She could see him arrive there. He looked at her. "Needle decompression," he said. "Second intercostal space, midclavicular." "I can do it," Stroud said. The word "can" in an ER coming from a nurse is a specific kind of statement. It isn't "I'll prepare the supplies." It isn't "should I get someone?" It is a direct offer to perform a procedure, and it carries with it an implicit claim of competence that most nurses in a civilian ER would not make, because most nurses in a civilian ER had never done it outside of a simulation. Caulfield looked at her for a long moment. The monitor behind him showed Ortega's blood pressure at 68/40 and trending down. Caulfield was not a stupid man. "Do it," he said. She was already moving. The 14-gauge angiocath was in her hand before he finished the sentence. She'd staged it on the tray when the gurney came in. the same way she used to stage everything in the field. Because in the field, you didn't wait to be told to be ready. She found the landmark by touch, confirmed position, and drove the needle into the second intercostal space. The hiss of trapped air was audible over the noise of the room. Ortega's oxygen saturation, which had been dropping through the low 80s, began to climb. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the monitor beeped, and the numbers kept improving, and the room exhaled as one. Caulfield watched the monitor. Then he looked at Stroud. His face had a quality she recognized. Not embarrassment exactly, but the careful recalibration of a man who has just updated a prior belief and isn't quite sure yet what to do with the new information. "Where did you train?" he asked. "I'll tell you later," she said. "He still needs a chest tube." That night in the parking lot, Forsyth caught up with her. "Caulfield asked me about you," Forsyth said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know anything about your background except what was in your file." Forsyth paused. "Which isn't much." Stroud unlocked her car. The night was cold and flat and Midwestern, the kind of night that went on forever in every direction. "You've done that before," Forsyth said. It wasn't a question. The needle decompression. "You've done it on a real patient, not a simulation." Stroud didn't answer immediately. She thought about the first time she'd done it. Not in an ER. Not with clean lighting and a full team. But in the back of a cramped MRAP somewhere in Kandahar province, on a 23-year-old specialist who'd taken shrapnel to the chest and whose name Stroud still said sometimes, quietly, on the anniversaries, Dawson. His name was Dawson, and he'd lived. "Yes," she said, "I've done it before." Forsyth looked at her for a moment longer. Then she nodded, once, and walked back toward the hospital entrance. The next 2 weeks were different, not dramatically. The ER didn't throw her a party. Caulfield didn't apologize publicly. Nobody updated her title. But the way people moved around her changed. Diaz stopped giving her unsolicited advice. The techs started coming to her with questions they used to take to the senior nurses. Obi, who turned out to be sharp and genuinely curious, started finding reasons to be in the same room when Stroud was working a difficult case. Caulfield was more complicated. He was not, by nature, a humble man, but he was, when it actually mattered, a good doctor, which meant he had learned at some point that survival required updating your assessments when new information arrived. He started doing it with Stroud. Not warmly, not at first, but honestly. He stopped explaining things at the wrong level. He started asking her opinion on cases where the presentation was unclear. She didn't make a performance of it. She just answered his questions. The moment everything changed publicly happened on a Wednesday, about 5 weeks in, and it had nothing to do with anything that happened inside the hospital. It was 7:40 in the morning, 20 minutes before the end of night shift. Stroud was finishing notes when the ambulance radio went off again. Not with a trauma call this time, but with something the dispatcher described as a military transport requesting ER clearance for a critical patient. The request came through a channel the floor didn't normally see, routed through the hospital's emergency management office, and it was accompanied by a brief that included the words "special operations" and "need confirmation of on-site qualified personnel." Forsyth took the call at the desk. Her expression shifted in a way that was hard to read. 2 minutes later, she came and found Stroud. "There's a team coming in," Forsyth said quietly. "A special operations unit. Training accident. One critical, severe hemorrhage, already stabilized in the field, but they're pushing him to us. They asked if we have anyone with combat trauma experience." Stroud set down her pen. How critical? Femoral. Tourniquet's been on for 40 minutes. They need someone who's managed prolonged field care on a vascular injury. The phrase prolonged field care was not a phrase that appeared in civilian nursing curricula. It was a specific military medical term for a specific situation, and Forsyth either didn't notice Stroud's reaction to it or pretended not to. I can take it, Stroud said. I know you can, Forsyth said. I already told them yes. The helicopter landed on the roof pad at 7:58. By the time the patient was brought down, the morning shift had started filling the floor, and there was a small involuntary gathering in the hallway. Not a crowd exactly, but the kind of accumulation that happens when people sense something outside the ordinary is occurring. Caulfield was there. Obi was there. Diaz. 3 or 4 other nurses who had no clinical reason to be in that corridor. What came through the doors was a controlled, fast-moving team of 4 men in full tactical gear, pushing a gurney. They were focused and quiet in the way that people in high-stakes situations are quiet. Not calm, exactly, but disciplined, everything compressed. The patient was conscious, pale, a tourniquet high on his left thigh. One of the team members was maintaining direct pressure on the wound, while the other 3 moved. The man at the front of the team stopped when he saw Stroud. He was a large man, mid-40s, with the kind of face that had been through weather, both literal and otherwise. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he said her name, Stroud. Not Nurse Stroud, not ma'am, just her last name, the way you said the last name of someone you had served beside. The way the name itself carried all the context of the shared history inside it. The hallway went very quiet. Chief, she said. He didn't smile. Neither did she. But something passed between them that everyone in that hallway witnessed, and none of them could fully name. The recognition between 2 people who had been in the same terrible places and come out the other side. My guy needs a vascular surgeon and someone who knows how to keep him alive until we get one, the man said. I heard you work here now. I do, she said. Can you take him? Yes. She turned and led the team to Trauma 1. What happened in the next 40 minutes was not remarkable to anyone who had worked with Stroud for the past 5 weeks. She was systematic, calm, decisive, exactly as she had always been. But to Caulfield, who stood in the doorway and watched, it was something different, because he was watching her manage a trauma the way she had clearly managed traumas before this one, before this hospital. In circumstances he was only beginning to understand. She knew the patient's unit's specific medical protocols. She knew what the team had already done in the field and built on it without asking them to repeat steps. She talked to the conscious patient in a way that was neither clinical nor patronizing. A particular steadiness, the voice of someone who had used that voice before to keep people from going under. The vascular surgeon arrived 17 minutes in. The patient made it to the OR. In the hallway afterward, as the team was preparing to leave, Forsyth asked the man, the one who had called Stroud by her name, how they'd known to request her specifically. He looked at Forsyth with a kind of patient attention, the way someone looks at a reasonable question they've been given permission to answer. She served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, he said, 4 deployments, medical sergeant. She held 2 of my men alive in a ditch in Paktia province for 6 hours with no supplies and 1 working light. He paused. We knew where she was because we keep track of our people. He looked back at Stroud once more. You look good in scrubs, he said. It sounded like the highest compliment he was capable of giving. Then the team moved out, efficient and quiet, the way they'd arrived, and the hallway was left with the people who remained. Nobody spoke for a moment. Caulfield was still in the doorway. He had his arms crossed, but not in the defensive way he sometimes carried them, more the posture of a man who has just finished reading something and is deciding what it means. He looked at Stroud. "Medical sergeant," he said. "75th Rangers." "Yes," she said. "4 deployments." "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. "Why didn't you tell us?" She'd thought about how she would answer that question the day it came. She'd known it would come eventually. "Because I didn't want to be hired for what I used to do," she said. "I wanted to find out what I could do here." She looked at him steadily. "And I needed to find out if this place was worth it." He absorbed that. She could see him working through it honestly. The assumption he'd made, the weeks he'd spent treating her like someone who needed to be guided toward competence, the cost of that in time and in the ways it must have landed on her. He was not a man who apologized easily, but he was a man who could face things directly. "Is it," he asked, "worth it?" She thought about Ortega, whose oxygen saturation had climbed back into the 90s. She thought about Obi, who was going to be a genuinely good doctor in 3 years. She thought about Forsyth, who had quietly, without announcement, simply started treating her differently the moment the evidence warranted it. "I think so," Stroud said. "Ask me again in a year." Caulfield nodded. It was a small nod, the kind that meant more than a large one would have. Diaz was standing a few feet away. She'd heard all of it. She looked at Stroud with an expression that was partly embarrassment and partly something warmer. "I gave you advice your second week," she said, "about pushing back." "You did," Stroud said. "I feel a little stupid about that." "Don't," Stroud said. "It wasn't bad advice. It just wasn't advice I needed." Later that afternoon, after her shift had ended, and she was sitting in her car in the parking lot with the engine off and the Illinois sky going gray above the roofline, she thought about what the chief had said. "We keep track of our people." She'd known he would come eventually. Not like that. Not with a helicopter and a critical patient and a hallway full of witnesses. But she'd known that the people she'd served with would find her the way they always found each other. The way people who have been in the same hard places always carry a low-frequency signal that others from those places can hear. She'd been quiet here, deliberately, carefully quiet. She'd wanted to build something from scratch, without the weight of a reputation preceding her, without the risk that every skill she demonstrated would be attributed to a past life rather than a present competence. She'd wanted to belong to this place on its own terms. She thought she was starting to. She started the car. The heater came on. Outside, the Mercy General parking lot looked like every parking lot in every Midwestern city. Flat and gray and ordinary, the kind of place where nothing seemed to happen. But she'd learned a long time ago that ordinary-looking places were where everything actually happened. Where people arrived broken and left whole if the right people were there. Where the quietest person in the room could be the one carrying the most. She pulled out of the lot. She had to be back in 15 hours. She was already thinking about the cases she'd hand off, the notes she still needed to finish. The supply cart she'd noticed was running low on 14-gauge angiocaths. She made a mental note to restock them. In her experience, you always needed more than you thought you would.